The way I came to this idea of immediate revolution was admittedly a long and twisted story. Not twisted in the sense of dark, though. It has that moment, or those moments. But, multiple dark moments. Come on, who are we kidding? But, the twist was more just like the trajectory of it. Just a few different strands of it. Definitely some of it came from anarchism. Some of it came from revolutionary socialism. And, some of it comes from democratic socialism, and it's sort of the collision of these three that drove me in the direction that I ended up in, which is, I guess you would say the anarchist idea of revolution is simply attack. Many anarchists are anti-strategy. They think, just live in the now, and resistance is contagious, just resist however you can. Issue being, it just sort of lives in denial of the material reality of the dimension of time. That there are far better times to attack than not. So it's just, strategy does matter. And it's not just waiting for the right opportunity to, start a riot or something. It's more, I don't know. There's also deeper issues with anarchism, whereas, as I've said elsewhere, I don't really think the American public is ready for an anarchist revolution, though they, I think, definitely lean in an anti-authoritarian direction. And then what else do you got? You got, so I guess I could say this came from the exhaustion of three different strategies, but also combining them. So there was anarchism, revolutionary socialism, democratic socialism. So anarchism, the benefit, though, of anarchism was that it's kind of what I started as. And I kind of just, I was having a long moment where I was like, man, things are really screwed up and I don't see anyone that has a convincing plan. So I just sort of start going back and reviewing all, the classic, anarchist media. I'm watching Mr. Robot, and that gets me thinking about Fight Club and The Matrix and the what I call the 1999 holy trinity of anti-corporate movies, the everyman anti-corporate movies of Fight Club, The Matrix, and Office Space, which is the funnier one, so, of the three. So, or at least the more lighthearted one. So then you got, and I was just sort of okay, well, how do they start revolutions in those movies? Nothing that seems realistic or effective. And so you just sort of think about it, and you're like, all right, so what else? The Wachowskis, they made The Matrix. What else did they make? They made V for Vendetta. Okay, so what's V for Vendetta? It's got a mass revolution. That's good. And I'm like, all right, how do you start those? I'm like, what's a mass revolution in real life? What's the most recent American example I can think of? I'm like, all right, there's Occupy. Anonymous was sort of around in Occupy. That's cool. But then, what was the last big thing in America before Occupy? And I really feel the Battle of Seattle, all the way back to 1999. Yeah, we got to go all the way back to 1999. And so I just start looking. I was like, how did they start the Battle of Seattle? I have no idea. So I'm looking into it. And so I just I look into them, and I'm Googling things like mass resistance and how to start mass resistance. And between what the people who started Seattle did, I watched the movie Battle of Seattle, which is actually kind of good. And I just sort of looked into what did they do. And I found there's this theorist called Gene Sharp. And he there's this movie about him called How to Start a Revolution. It's got a lot to do with the Arab Springs. I'm gonna finish this. So I guess basically the next issue was an issue with Leninism, where there's 5 million iterations of Leninism. It's like Baskin Robbins, but I guess the ones I was sort of oriented towards, some of them were sort of trying to take a shortcut through electoral methods, and I guess so was I. Yeah, I was into that. And then that just ended up becoming the Bernie Sanders campaign. I'm like, all right, that's cool, but what if they rob Bernie? Or what if, I don't know, what if he just doesn't win, which looks less likely? Or what if the DNC steals it? Or I don't know, what if something just happens? What if something happens other than, yay, vote for Bernie, everything works out? So I don't really think that, I've criticized third-party tactics elsewhere. But the thing of it is they, like, other than some kind of electoral front like Bernie or something, the Leninist strategy is kind of the same across all the varieties, which is you need a workers' council revolution, unless you get into like Maoism or Stalinism, which I don't screw with. So I guess I'm just cutting them out. But what's funny is my actual approach is kind of more similar to theirs in terms of the revolutionary strategy, which is that you don't actually need to wait for workers' councils. You don't need to wait for the spontaneous activity of the working class to create workers' councils. And everyone says, oh, build the labor movement, and that's how you build up to that point. But I don't agree with that whatsoever anymore. I think it's nice to have a labor movement. I'm certainly not against a labor movement, but I just have ceased to see it as having anything to do with actual regime change or revolution. Basically, the pattern I've seen historically is that revolutionaries start the revolution and then unions get on board after. The unions don't start it. Unions get on board with other people who have started it, whether some insurgent government or mass demonstrators over some other issue, and then the unions join. That's how it happens. It's not, the unions never start the revolution, as far as I've seen. So, so I'm just sort of skeptical of Leninist labor approach, Leninist electoral approaches. I'm just like, okay, what's the revolution? Their revolution is like workers' councils, and it's just like, oh, we're just supposed to wait for this mass mutiny in the workplace, like spontaneously across the country, like. America's like, I don't know, like I don't know if like that's really how we can do it, like because we have such, like other countries have had a history of workers' council uprisings and we really don't have much of one at all. Then there was the issue raised, and this was sort of, this took me through the whole like left book psycho spiral of like nihilist communism and like left communism, where I just sort of like ended up in the orbit of that because everybody did, because those people were actually like the founders of left book somehow, and like all like the tag groups of like like sounds liberal but okay and all that crap actually spiraled off of them. It was really weird. But those people all became what's called neo-Trotskyist, which is like this pre-Leninist form of Marxism that like focuses on a bit of electoral work, but also this idea of like balancing reform and revolution. And this finally brings me, well, okay, so this is what happened with Leninism, where I just sort of saw that like Michael Macnair, this writer for the Communist Party of Great Britain, has this whole idea of you don't actually need to wait for the workers' councils. You can just build a revolutionary provisional government, or you can I don't know if he's as voluntaristic about it as I am, but that basically it doesn't revolve around workers' councils. That workers' councils are something you should have, but they don't have to be the state form. They don't need to be like a federation of councils being the government. You just need a government that defends their right to exist and govern in the workplace. So I was like, okay, this is a completely new take that, no, it's not new, but it was new to me. So this gave me a lot of hope over, what's it called? Over like it's just the sort of like Leninist hopelessness of like, oh, we just have to hope that the workers' councils materialize. Wow, this is depressing. Yeah, so especially with climate change only 10 years away, like climate irreversibility is the year 2030 according to the United Nations International Panel on Climate Change. So I was just like, we need something a little more accelerating than just like the classic Leninist wait for the workers' councils, do like some kind of electoral strategy, blah blah. Because I think the electoral strategy is like Bernie's the best bet you got right now, and the rest are just like a dead end. And even Bernie may run into the wall. We'll see. So, and what else do you got? So that moves me back more in the democratic socialist area, and that's cool. I moved towards examining Poulantzas a bit, but not really being satisfied with them. I think Poulantzas is good because Poulantzas sort of gets on the Mike Macnair level a little bit, saying like, it's not so much about necessarily smashing the state. You sort of need to seize the state, at least certain of its like agencies and stuff, like that you need to bring them over to the new society. But like, so Poulantzas talks a bit about that and how, and this goes very well with the Gene Sharp sort of how to start a revolution nonviolent strategy of you don't attack the state pillars like bureaucracy, police, army, if possible, media. You win them over from the old regime to yours. And it just creates a situation where like the old regime is unable to govern and either gets just like knocked off by someone in the pillars or arrested or exiled or something. So yeah, that's what you want, and that's my orientation. So where it connects with democratic socialism is this guy Poulantzas sort of has a similar idea, except I feel like Poulantzas never spells it out enough, like what's supposed to be happening. And it's just sort of really frustrating to me. He's like, okay, we use elections to prepare a conflict with capitalism, but like he never actually, says like what the more decisive revolutionary conflict looks like, other than the fact that he says instead of against the state, it might be within the state. And I agree with that part, actually. That like, takes me finally to the coup d'etat manual, a devilish book that I've been reading. Definitely a book with an aura around it. The coup d'etat practical handbook or practical manual basically says that this is perfectly acceptable, that or at least not acceptable, but it gives a perfect explanation of how to do these things, of how to stage this type of transition in a government. Except I don't know. It seems what's funny is the Gene Sharp's sort of nonviolent strategy using crowds and Edward Luttwak's like coup d'etat description using like infiltration of the state pillars actually seem weirdly similar because they both are about winning over the pillars. They just use different methods of doing so. And what's funny is those methods aren't entirely incompatible. You can have like crowd pressure on the pillars while talking to individuals simultaneously. So, you can flip the pillars in numerous and multiple ways, really. But, so what this brought me all to bring it all around, was this idea that immediate revolution is possible in the following way. That if you have an understand... Yeah, so it's like, oh, well, we'll have a revolution. Wow. That gets wild real fast. Like, people are like, okay, well, a lot of people hate the system. They would support a demand to remove Congress, but then they're like, but what comes next? And that's a really important question. I can't really, like, in theory, you could just have a soft coup d'etat to, like, replace America's crappy electoral system with just, like, a newer one under, like, a capitalist framework. I definitely don't limit my ambitions to that. Like, if I'm organizing something, like, if you organize pressure further to the left and then that's what ends up happening, I mean, I'll accept it as a positive result, but I'm more into this idea that, like, you can actually, like, sometimes in like various countries, people have just like declared new republics. Like they're like, okay, the old republic is done. We're having like the second republic or the fifth republic or whatever. And it's just like, well, is there a reason that America can't do that? That's where I'm at. I'm seeing if we can just declare a new republic. And it's like, well, how do you just declare one? And it's like, well, I just did, and it's like, oh, well, that's interesting. Like, and the funny thing is it seems like it has a certain detachment from reality, like a certain voluntarism, a certain idealism. Like, what, are you just declaring a new republic as like a role-playing game? Well, yeah. And the funny thing is that's how it works. Like, you get a bunch of people in a room and they're like, what, role-playing being a revolutionary legislature, passing the laws that ought to exist. And that is the beginning of a revolutionary provisional government, and then you start holding street demonstrations calling for the removal of Congress and the installation of this thing. And it's just like, oh, wow, this is a new method I've never, like... I guess a lot of Leninists have a negative response to it because they're like, oh, it's not workers' councils. Like, you're substituting yourself for the action of the working class. And my response, and they're more importantly, I think, they tend to say that it's like voluntarist and idealist. You need a mass social base before you do something like this. And I tend to wonder if that's actually true. I think it's more likely, especially in volatile conditions like our current society, that you actually have a situation where what you need to do is advance the idea of revolution itself and what you're fighting for. And then start holding the anti-Congress demonstrations, and then people will be like, oh, what is this about? And then you can tell them. Now, I mean, I don't know if I'm going to do this now, but there's this thing called the anti-capitalist tolerance paradox, which accepts that because capitalism has material inequality, it can never be truly democratic, and therefore you actually have to exclude capitalism from the acceptable spectrum of democracy. And it's like, oh wow, that's a really intense view. And I can see how that slides into something similar to like what the Leninists and Soviets ended up doing, which is not exactly what I want to reiterate. Basically what I say, it's like plurality within the spectrum of democratic socialism. And then obviously you got to be like, okay, but then what does that mean? You got to have some sort of like spelled out list of positions. Be like, well, what is this new system? And you got to be like have like nationalization of the banks. You got to have like the workers' councils in the workplace. New things like abolishing the Electoral College, massively expanded direct democracy, economic bill of rights, all that. So I mean, there's more to it, but that's like the short list. So yeah, something like that you can just declare actually, and I mean, no one's ever stopped me from I've never held back from just launching very headstrong, headlong, voluntaristic initiatives myself. So I've just sort of started this parallel government, and it's like the immediate revolution is now. People are like, oh, are the masses in the street yet? It's like, well, they are. They just they're in the street against Trump. They're in the street around a million issues. So we can connect to that already existing like mass presence and mass engagement around things like Bernie, to actually just like generate support for like actual revolutionary transition, and not in the sense of like building a quote revolutionary party, which most people, they hear those words and they think like, that doesn't even compute. A party, like, isn't that something that runs in elections? What are you guys about? No, don't build a revolutionary party, just directly build a revolutionary government, and then you skip the whole like party state phase and just build what you actually wanted. So that's what I'm about, just directly building. Yeah, the immediate revolution is the immediate construction of a revolutionary provisional government combined with demonstrations that, instead of focusing on this or that social issue or candidate, their main slogan and demand is the removal of the existing regime, in our case Congress, and the installation of the revolutionary government. And this is a recipe that can be applied in any country. You can, the French could call for the removal of their legislature. Obviously people under dictatorship or something like that, in like Russia or China could use this against their governments. And so parallel government is a very powerful thing. But it's not just building a parallel government in isolation as a role play. It's in connection with street actions. And those street actions have to be built by a revolutionary movement organization, the likes of which you often see in countries before they have massive blow-ups. Like in many Eastern European countries, in like, decommunization, there was a revolutionary movement organization that did things like launch civil resistance and demonstrations. The Arab Spring, they had them too. Just groups that became the organizing focus point. But they didn't just become it. They were preparing to be that beforehand by being the people who organized these types of demonstrations before the demonstrations got big. It's just like, yeah, once you start anti-government demonstrations, then everyone gets on board. But before you start them, they seem crazy. And, so it's just like, that's how you do it. But I think there's a really important line from Rules for Radicals where Saul Alinsky says, like, when you introduce these new tactics to different communities, like, people will like have some resistance to it, not because the tactics are illogical. In fact, they work quite well. People will have resistance to it because they feel foolish. They feel like, wow, I could have done this eons ago. Does that mean I'm stupid or a coward? And no, it just means you didn't know, and it means, I didn't know either. I didn't hear about Gene Sharp's revolutionary strategy until like 2019, late 2019, and that movie had been around 8 years, and I'm like, oh wow, that movie came out in 2011. I'm slow on the uptake. So, but really, the revolutionary part, or the new synthesis that I'm calling it, is the combination of like Gene Sharp with like Mike Macnair, and maybe a little bit of Edward Luttwak. So that's what I'm doing, and I think it's possible to build. Oh, and I guess I just added my own fourth component onto it, which is just like the idea of building a parallel government from scratch, which I just learned from studying history, going back and looking at the Enlightenment revolutions as possibly a model for our own, maybe not. So, that's where I'm at. And so when you realize this, the revolution is now. Immediate revolution. when you realize this, it's quite overwhelming, and it actually gave me like a heart stoppage. There's medical dispute over what exactly occurred, but like I had a total full blown meltdown over this conceptual like emergence, and not I mean like physical meltdown. It was overwhelming, and it's cool because we're in this historic moment where we actually need something like this. But I don't really know who like would be the people to work with. I'm literally just working with random people who like role-playing games. And a lot of those people tend to be like progressive or punk or Bernie supporters. Good for me, good for us. I've turned the Revolution into a role-playing game where I just have a thing called Revolution RPG, and it's just like a 2.5 minute video that gives you the rules of how to build like a role-play legislature from scratch, and gives you the whole setup of being like a revolutionary legislature, legislating parallel legislation that comes true when you come to power and stuff. So it's like, weird stuff. And I don't know, maybe this is all just a mad game where like there's never any material basis for this. Nothing ever materializes. But what I think is funny is that, like, isn't that how most revolutions seem before they, like, explode? Like, they always seem like a mad idea. Like, that's just, like, completely disconnected from reality. And then they're right in everyone's face. And then suddenly everyone's like, oh, well now it makes sense in retrospect. You're saying now that it worked, but you were crazy before it worked, So, that's sort of what I'm dealing with. It's a very, I understand that it seems crazy. And I'm okay with that because so does everything else right now. And I'm going to call it there.